Hey, hello everybody. Welcome. Always lovely to see everyone, and I'm really touched by the reception that this series has received and by all of the interest from people. It's really exciting. You know, it's not muvan me'alav. It's not taken for granted that there are so many people who are interested in learning Torah on cold Monday nights. And yeah, I really appreciate all of your presence, all of your questions and insights. I'm a big believer that, there is certainly, I've put in time to research this and I have ideas that I'd like to share, but equally the questions and comments from people at home and people here are incredibly appreciated. Another thing that's also incredibly appreciated is the sponsors of tonight's shiur. So our learning for today is being sponsored by Anne and Henry Fadgerman in memory of their son, Michael, Ava Shalom. So Michael ben Yechezkel. And the learning that we do today should be to continue the Aliyah of the Neshama, and really we're incredibly appreciative to the Fadgerman family for facilitating that learning tonight. Organ donation. So this in many ways dovetails with what we've been discussing really last week and to an extent the week before as well. So we were talking last week about end-of-life care, focusing on the one hand, the dignity that a person towards the end of their life, it's incredibly important they experience, and how that can be balanced with an appreciation for every single person and the life that they do have and how life has intrinsic value. So this week, we're going to sort of extend some of those ideas, because organ donation is always a difficult situation, because if someone is receiving an organ, that means that someone else no longer has that organ. And there's lots of different ways that an organ can be donated. It can be from a person who's a live donor, or it can be from a person who's a deceased donor. And in both those situations, there's a sense of loss. In the context of a deceased donor, obviously that loss is much more profound, especially for the family. However, for a live donor, there's still a lot of emotional upheaval and difficulties that can possibly be encountered. So I think that's just an important frame that we should keep in mind when we're learning this. The statistics section that I brought at the beginning, the title that I called it really summarizes everything I was hoping to say, which is that organ donation has the potential to do a great good, and there's certainly a pressing need. And I think it's those 2 points that are essential for us to keep in mind. A great good is that really organ donation has the potential, depending on which organs, certainly to save people's lives when we're talking about things like hearts or lungs, certainly to improve people's quality of life, especially if we're talking about kidney donation and how that can change someone needing to regularly be on dialysis, completely reframe their life and their experiences. But also things, like a cornea transplant or skin, tissue. So there's so many different things, and the good that can be achieved through organ donation, I think, should never be understated. And really, that's a good which has been noticed in our lifetimes. The very first heart transplant, which has become very, very famous, was done in, does anyone know? Oh, I was going for the year, but well done for knowing the place. So we've got 69 and we've got 66. Do I have anything? I can be a bit of an auctioneer if you guys want. It was 1967. At least that's what Wikipedia said. And Wikipedia is always right. So 1967. So really we're talking about medical gains that have been realized in our own lifetime, and profound gains, Someone was mentioning to me before this shiur, and they mentioned a personal story of their father who had been a recipient of a heart transplant. And hearing, for me, I was really touched by hearing their experience and how, this was a person who, if someone's receiving a transplant, generally speaking, things are probably not going so well, almost certainly not going so well. And this person had received this heart transplant and, I think 14 years later is still alive. There are incredible medical gains that have been achieved through organ donation. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. and notice that it's something in our lifetimes very, very recent. At the same time, especially when we're talking about having a Jewish conversation, how old are our sources? Thousands of years. We've got sources, you know, a contemporary source can be 500 years old. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well, especially at the rapid rate of change, because organ donation 50 years ago in 1967 is not organ donation today. And when we look at halachic sources, we have to appreciate the context. Are we talking about when immunosuppressive therapies were around, or are we not? And I think that is something to keep in mind as well as we're learning and applying and thinking about these concepts, is when is it being written, by who is it being written, and in what context, which is something that we've seen over and over again. It's also fascinating, and I promise I'll finish my preamble with this, it's also fascinating to see how you find precedents. What sorts of precedents are the rabbis going to be using to discuss something like organ donation? What might be coming up? What are they? Because there's no organ donation in the Torah. There's no organ donation in the Gemara. But there are instances, for example, of people being captured and the ruler at the time saying, well, unless a person gives me their arm, I'm going to be killing that other person. So what sorts of examples are being used by the rabbis to have this conversation is another fascinating point. Okay, I want to keep moving, but what I want to essentially say is that there's, number one, a great good, like we've discussed, and number two, a pressing need. There are many more people who need organs than who there are organs available for. That's not something that is new information to any of you. Some of the details I've written down. But what I want to emphasize is that organ donation is relatively rare, in the sense that, you know, and that pyramid is what's trying to capture that idea that, you know, there's 170,000 people who are dying in hospitals out of the Australian population. And these are statistics all from last year. Of those, 170,000 people are dying. Of those, 80,000 are in hospitals. Of those 80,000, only about just over 1,000 are potentially eligible for organ transplantation, because not everyone's organs can be donated. And I assume that's something that a lot of people are familiar with as well. We need organs. Yep, Sarah, that's okay. To donate. Yes, to donate. And of those, you know, in Australia, the law is such that a family is always asked. So a family needs to be in agreement. And, you know, in instances where there's not a family, there's also like a donor card. So it's a family / the person has made their wish clear. And that's what we're seeing with that 56% conversion rate. So of the potential organs which could be donated in Australia in 2021, 56% of people who were possible actually ended up going down that path because there was that agreement. And I think it's important, you know, what we're going to see is that there are certainly rabbis on all different sides of the spectrum. And, you know, at that point is an incredibly valuable time if a person chooses to involve potentially a halachic authority or whoever else. Like, you know, in Australia, the rule is such that people will always be asked. So I think that's an important point to mention as well. Anyways, 655 consents, only 421 donors. So it's not a huge number, but each donor has the potential to give more than one organ, or, you know, an organ can be divided and go to different people. So that's where you're getting the 1174. Now, that is the set of statistics that are around people who are donation from deceased donors. There is also, and this is what we're seeing, many people who are living organ donors. So the most common example of that would be a kidney that gets donated from a living person to another living person, and then that person, you know, can probably stop dialysis, is the environment that is often occurring in. I think what's also important to mention is that we as a Jewish community do lots of things really, really wonderfully, and certain things that there's areas for improvement. One of the things that we do wonderfully, Israel has the highest rate of live kidney donors globally, and that's a stat from 2020 from the World Health Organization. Live kidney donors, the Jewish community, I don't know, have statistics for Australia, but certainly in America and Israel, it's often reported that there's a very high rate. What there's not a very high rate of are donations from deceased donors. And to the point where, and I think this is something that, we should all sit with us, that, Israel wanted to be part of Eurotransplant, which is like the network across the whole Europe for organs that could be donated and matched with potential people. And it's really important to have a matched a matched organ, because you want people to be able to have the organ that their body is going to be most likely to accept. And Israel was not able to join Eurotransplant because there are too few organs coming. And I think this is something that our community needs to acknowledge. And, on the one hand, incredibly high rate of live kidney donors, but at the same time, low rate of donations, even though people are often willing to accept organs, but not necessarily to donate. So I think that's something that just needs to be said out loud. Yes.
Do you think that a bureaucratic issue or?
So we'll come to part of that. I think that as much as there are religious motivations around the deceased organ conversation, because we know that some, and we'll get into some of this as well, that one of the concepts that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is around the when does death start conversation, around when does life end, is brain death considered? I think that halakhic conversation is incredibly deep and important, and we'll try to have part of that conversation today. At the same time, that's not all deceased donors. There's deceased donors of people who have been certified. So yes, I will certainly repeat the questions. The question, just for context, was, do you mind repeating it again?
Yeah, the reason for
yeah. So question is, what might be some of the reasons why that donation rate is lower? And what I'm trying to suggest is that there are certainly halakhic underpinnings and motivations for some people, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of it is the same reasons that things happen in all parts of life, prioritization, that it's just something that people have heard is not the best thing, or it's not the most important thing to people necessarily. It's not on the front of people's minds. I think all of these sorts of issues that come up in a lot of other contexts are also relevant to this conversation. And that's part of what I want to get to, is that, as much as we can talk about the pointy end example of a heart transplant and whether or not you think which way about organ donation and brain death, you can donate blood, you can donate bone marrow, you can donate a kidney, you can donate so many things either in a live context or in a deceased context that rabbis focus on and say is permissible. And I think that, there's a tendency to say, well, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, and less of a tendency to say, look at this wide rabbinic support for this potential way that I could help and I could do something good. So I think that, we sort of get stuck on the issues and don't focus enough on the areas that we could donate, for example, bone marrow transplants, for example, which again, the community does well at. So I'm not here to critique those elements. Onwards and upwards, or any other questions?
Well, just one question. You talked about matching. Matching also includes the kind of cell structure or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's not everyone can just donate a kidney to somebody else,
sure.
and anybody. What's the sort of proportion of people who can match successfully?
Yeah, so another thing that I should also caveat and say, the question at home is, what's the proportion of people that can match? I am not a transplant surgeon. I am, I've gone through medical school and I work as a junior doctor. So, I have done research for this and I'm sort of, in general terms across it, but I don't have specific answers to questions like that. I'm sorry.
But it is an issue, isn't it?
Yeah, as in the proportion, yeah, for sure. Finding the right potential donor is a big issue in all of this conversation. And that's part of what I wanted to get to in terms of looking at the potential issues. So you've spoken about one of the societal issues. And that's really about, how do we get the right organs at the right place for the right people at the right time? In that story that I was hearing, there was a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning, from a person in our community. There was a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning saying, please make your way to the hospital now. The access element is certainly a point that needs to be considered in all of this. And that's, how do we incentivize donation? How do we fund it, et cetera, et cetera? How do we retrieve it? How do we allocate it? So all of those issues are certainly issues that we have to think about. Where I think it's just worth, I've tried to break up the potential issues, and what I'm trying to get to as an endpoint, maybe in this conversation, I have a bit more of a personal bias, which I'm happy to share with you, that, I've mentioned that I think organ donation is incredibly important. And I mentioned that I think that we as a community can definitely do more in certain areas. There are definitely issues, and irrespective of where a person lands on specific iterations of those issues, there's potential of what we can do. And that's what I'd like to work us through, is how can we navigate some of these issues? And even if, we might like some people might have disagreements around the brain death point, that shouldn't change, there's so many other things that people can do. So I'm trying to keep that positive, what we can do, rather than these are the barriers framework. So what are some of the barriers, so we know what we can jump over? There's an element of risk. There's an element of risk to a person who's accepting an organ, and there's an element of risk to a person who is giving an organ. That risk profile obviously changes at different surgeries for different times for different people, but that, especially in the early years of surgery, was what led various rabbis to say organ donation is a really bad idea, because you're encountering too much risk without getting any benefit from it. Because in the early years of transplantation, it wasn't, people were surviving days, weeks. People were not surviving the time frames that we're seeing now. That very first heart transplant, does anyone know how long he lived for after? 18 days is how long Louis Bushkansky, I think his name was, lived for. 18 days. So, this is a conversation that we had previously about the sacrificing of Chayei Sha'ah. When is that valuable? When is that allowed? When are you allowed to take risks with Chayei Sha'ah? So the risk that a person might encounter as a donor or as a recipient is something that the rabbis certainly engage with. There's also some other things that I want to mention, and I'm conscious of the time, so I'd like to keep moving. But specifically with a deceased donor, in terms of delaying the burial or an organ not being with a person when they die because it's been transplanted to someone else, as issues like desecrating the body, those are issues full stop. And people are aware of those issues. But just like we saw in a lot of other areas, certain prohibitions can be overridden if you're going to be saving a life. In a situation of pikuach nefesh, just like we override Shabbat, we override specific issues like, for example, burying the body complete. For example, deriving benefit from a dead body. And for example, desecrating in some way that body, because you're cutting that body open to extract an organ. So what I'm trying to show is that there are certainly issues that are at play, but a lot of those issues can be circumvented or can be, they're not in full force, or they're overridden by alternative considerations around the benefits of organ transplantation. Is that okay? Any questions? Yes, what was the question on the chat? Excellent question. So does the removed organ need to be buried? And I'm sure that people are familiar with the work of an organization like Zaka, which in the instances of terrorist attacks will go and try to reclaim every scrap of the body which has been, which is no longer connected to that body. Where organ donation changes is that what we say is that the organ that has been transplanted into a donor, into a recipient, now becomes part of the recipient's body. So yes, it does need to be buried, but with its new recipient host. What about the organ that was removed? Excellent question. So think about, for example, a person whose leg is amputated, not in the context of an organ donation, just in general, a person's nails or any part of a person's body. The definition of when, like if someone donates blood, what's meant to happen to that blood? Essentially, the requirement for things to be buried with someone only kicks into force once a person is no longer alive. So it does not need to be buried with the person. Any other questions? Yep.
Are there issues with organs removed but not actually implanted into a recipient? Because this happens a lot too. Organs can deteriorate or turn out at the last minute not to be suitable. Yeah,
so the question for those at home is, are there potential issues with organs that are removed which do not get donated? And yeah, halachic issues. And I think, that's a good framing, because there are certainly ethical issues with that, independent of halachic issues. But yes, halachic issues will also exist. And that's part of why in all of this conversation, the conversation around donating an organ is very different from the conversation around donating someone's body to science, for example, where in the context of donating someone's body to science, generally speaking, halachic poskim wouldn't view that in the most positive light, because even though that's going to help people in the long run through research, the definition that the rabbis are employing of saving a life is a much narrower definition. It has to be what's called lefanenu, before us. So there has to be an identified person, or at least, where in general that person is. And there has to be some chance that you would save them through this procedure. So, the abstract is not quite good enough. There has to be some sort of specific person that we're pointing to. But, we're able to extend that definition if we know that there's definitely going to be a person. So, a good example for that is in a wartime setting around the need to build a hospital on Shabbat. If you're, do you build a field hospital, or do you wait till someone's injured and then build the hospital? Well, no, the expectation is that someone is going to be injured in a wartime setting, so you can preemptively build the hospital. But you can hear how all of this needs to have a lot of thought. Are we all on the same page? Are we okay? Okay. Any questions, or keep moving? Let's keep moving. So I think what I'm trying to say in this next source around encountering risk is that we'll read it together. Minayin leroy et chavero. This is a source from the Gemara. How do we know from someone who sees his friend that this person is drowning, or chaya boroto, or listin ba'in alav, or this person has been mauled by some sort of animal, or has been set upon by robbers? Shehu chayav lahatzilo, that a person who's observing this needs to save that person. And the Gemara gives a source. You should not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. You need to intervene and save someone. So what we're seeing there is a person being obligated to take certain risks to save someone else. And that's what the rabbis do with this source. They extract from this source the necessity to put yourself at some level of risk in order to help others. But of course, the question then becomes, well, how much risk is too much? And for that, we can look to the next source, which is a responsa from the Radbaz, Rabbi David ben Shlomo ibn Zimra. And he has a fascinating biography. This is a source about a question that he was asked. And the question itself is, there has been a person who has stolen, and the Sultan at the time is saying that, and then the Sultan at the time punished this person and said, I'm going to remove this person's arm as punishment because they stole. The person then fled and made their way to Egypt from Turkey. So now they're in Egypt, and the Radbaz is one of the rabbis in Egypt. And in Egypt, this gentleman receives a letter from the Sultan saying, hello, I know you're in Egypt. Just so you know, I have captured a certain gentleman, and he is currently in my palace. And if you do not return and sacrifice your arm, I will be ending this gentleman's life. So this person who's in Egypt went to the Radbaz and asked him, what am I meant to do? Am I meant to go back or not? Let's just pause on that. Do we at least see how, this needs to be the sources that people are thinking about for paralleling with organ transplantation? We don't have sources that talk about organ transplant, so we have to think a bit more laterally. So what the essence of what the Radbaz says, in that particular case, returning is not necessary, but is midat chasidut, is a lovely thing for you to do, but you are not obligated to put yourself at that level of risk in order to save the life of someone else. So what is too much risk? Getting your hand chopped off will constitute too much risk. But you're still allowed to. Remember that last week we were talking about how rabbinic answers don't take yes and no binary forms. Rabbinic answers take a range of forms. So this is an example of where the rabbinic answer is, you can if you want, and it's a lovely thing to do, but it's not necessary. But then the Radbaz institutes other criteria, which instead of being midat chasidut, the Radbaz says this would constitute you now being a chasid shoteh, a pious fool. i.e. taking excessive risk in situations where, and שיבואו האונס עליו מפני חברו לא שמענו, ואשרי חלקו מי שיכול לעמוד בזה, ואם יש ספק סכנת נפשות, if there's the potential for someone to potentially lose their life, so the expectation is that when a person's arm is removed, that that person will still continue being living. However, if there's a potential that the person will lose their life, you are not meant to put yourself at risk, according to the Rabbi, to save someone else's life at the cost of potentially losing your own life. So that is the line of where the Rabbi says too far. And that would make you a pious fool. What I'm trying to get to is, we can appreciate that there are lines of risk that people are able to take. There are really three categories of halakhic risk, where the rabbis would say that is so much risk that you are definitely not allowed to do that. For example, heart transplantation in the early days. That is an acceptable level of risk that you can, if you want, engage in it. And then there's a third category, which is that is a level of risk that is so minuscule, walking down the street is not, it's a level of risk that you're willing to tolerate every single day. And if that level of risk is not a reason for you to say, I actually don't want to do this. A good example of that in the organ donation sphere would be, at least according to Rav Osher Weiss, donating blood for people who need blood, and donating bone marrow, and potentially donating a kidney as well. Donating a kidney is kind of on the line, because the level of risk that you're subjecting yourself to is relatively low, and the good that is being done is so high. So that's at least Rav Osher Weiss's conception. Then there are other types of donations that would sit in the, this is an acceptable donation to do, but it's not a halakhically mandated donation. And then there's the category again, which there are no organs that I'm familiar with where the rabbis have said, this is a really bad idea, don't do it. But they certainly said that previously about, for example, heart transplantation. Are we okay?
A question coming through, maybe we'll touch on this later, but it's not. Are the implications or permissions different? The organ transplantation will not save, but simply improve the person's life, for example, corneal transplant.
That is a fascinating question. For those at home, the question is, what about organ donation, which doesn't save people's lives, however, improves people's life? How much is quality of life important? Corneal transplant is actually a fascinating example because I have a get out of jail free card for that, which is the rabbis have made an equation which might be a little bit difficult for people to hear, but is the rabbinic position, that there are certain limitations around blindness such that in certain halakhic senses, a person who is blind is being viewed as potentially at risk of losing their life. And the easy way to explain that is that, they might trip over and fall down the stairs, but there is a deeper understanding that's put forward as well, where, there's an incredible valuing of sight. So in the specific narrow example of corneal transplant, I can get out of jail and say that all of the leniencies that the rabbis have for saving lives actually kick into gear, even though our understanding is that corneal transplants improve but do not save lives. So I have a get out of jail free card on that one. Skin transplants. Yeah, excellent. So then there are other types of transplant, like for example, tissue transplantation, skin transplantation, which those ones have a different set of halachic considerations. And the short version is that in those specific examples, it's a different set of considerations, but the rabbis can do the work necessary that gets us to a place where it's halachically acceptable. But it's not using the same mechanics, because we can't say that it's saving a life because it's not saving a life. They have to invoke alternative concepts, like, for example, a person feeling embarrassed in public. So there are alternative halachic mechanisms that need to be employed, but the end result is that we can get to the goal. Or I don't know if it's a goal, but for me, it's a goal. Yes, so sure. So there's an entire conversation about that. Yes. So there is actually an entire set of literature on that. I read it and I sort of was like, that would be fascinating, but we won't have time to go through that in the shiur. And of course, that's the question that came up. So you take the wins that you can get. Cassie, maybe can I send you some of that literature directly? Would that be okay? But yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. Okay. At this point, I want to do a little bit of medical backgrounding. Is that okay? Do we have any other questions before we do that? So the medical backgrounding is, so like I mentioned, there's a potential for an organ to be donated from a live donor, and that would be like a kidney donation. There's an option for an organ to be donated from a deceased donor, from a donor who is no longer alive. That could either be one of two definitions of death. The first definition is sort of the more standard definition of death that people will be familiar with, which is like an irreversible cessation, an irreversible stopping of the heart and the lungs, or at least the heart. That's one kind of definition of a person who's no longer alive. Another definition is what we would colloquially call brain death. And what exactly that means, and how exactly you measure that is a whole conversation, but at least let's take it at this point that there is some sort of situation where a person would be termed no longer alive in the setting of blood not flowing to their brain stem. Now, why is that important? That becomes important because of an element of physiology. So the heart pumps blood around the body. The heart does that with an automatic pacemaker. So if you take a heart outside of a body, as long as the cells are working sufficiently, as long as the cells have blood being pumped to them, which the heart can do for a short amount of time at least, that heart will keep pump by itself. It has an intrinsic pacemaker, which is different from the lungs. The lungs don't breathe by themselves. The lungs only breathe when they're connected and because they're connected to the brain. Okay? So if someone is alive in the setting of brain death, what one might say is occurring is that the heart is pumping, pump, because of its intrinsic pacemaker. But what about the breathing? Why is the breathing happening? Because it's not coming from the brain. Where is it coming from? The ventilator that the person's attached to. The ventilator that the person's attached to is helping them to breathe. The heart is beating by itself. The brain is not doing either. Is that sort of okay as a baseline? Okay, let's keep going. That is one of the reasons that motivates the conversation. And now we go over the page. Is brain death halachically equivalent to death? Because the organs that are continuing to be perfused, the organs that are continuing to receive blood, are in some sense like going to be better and more suitable for transplantation. So number one, there are certain organs that can only be transplanted in the setting of brain death, like for example, a heart. Number two, there are certain organs which, even though they can be transplanted in both types of a person no longer being alive, they are better in some sense. They are more likely to be successful. They are in some sense healthier, let's call it, if they are coming from a person who is brain deaf as opposed to being termed dead by irreversible cardiopulmonary circulation. Okay, are we okay on that? Now, other points that are necessary to sort of say out loud is, notice how we spoke earlier about saving people's lives. What are things that you're not allowed to do to save people's lives? Idolatry. What else? What are you not allowed to do to save people's lives? Yep. Kill someone else. And what's the third one? Pardon? So that's a slightly separate conversation, but yes, there is an element of that as well. But sort of three cardinal sins that people would talk about would be murder, sexual immorality, and idolatry. So and is organ transplantation any of those? So you're not allowed to murder someone even to save someone else's life. Now let's get to, for a second, what we think about organ transplantation soon, but just important that when we're talking about transplanting an organ, you can't kill someone in that process. You can take an organ from a person who's no longer alive, but you cannot cause the end of someone's life in the process of taking that organ. That wouldn't be valid grounds. So, and that's what we're seeing in the Mishnah, and we won't go through the details, but just ein dochim nefesh mipnei nefesh. We do not push aside one life for another life. That's the essence of it. Now, Rabbi Professor Avram Steinberg, who I think is a fascinating character that we should all be learning about, and I was going to bring his books, but I left them in the other room, so they're not here. But he's honestly, he's a hero. He's a hero of mine. Should be a hero of all of yours as well. So he's alive presently. We actually had him speak in the shul a few years ago when he was here. He is the director of the Hebrew University Center for Medical Ethics. He's a pediatric neurologist at Shaarei Tzedek. He studied at Merkaz Harav. He studied medicine at Hebrew U. He served in the IDF. He's the author of the Israel Prize winning Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics. And on the side, by the way, he's the chief editor of the Encyclopedia Talmud, just as one does. So he's a phenomenal character. And unlike a lot of the other rabbis that we've mentioned up until now, he's a medical professional. So he's one of very few people who is on the one hand a medical professional, but on the other hand has the religious clout, firstly to be involved with all of the serious poskim, but also is viewed as his own opinions having weight themselves, which is a very unusual thing. Most people sort of sit in one world or the other. He's one of very few people who bridges both worlds. He's phenomenal. And he's done lots of things. But one of the things that he did is write this source, and the essence of it is trying to explain that from a biological perspective, death is a process. We're sort of being artificial in saying when is the moment of death. Well, that's not really how we should be thinking about it. This means that various cells and organs die or cease to function at different points in the process, in accordance with their relative vulnerability to lack of oxygen, blood, and other life-sustaining substances. Determining a particular moment in the process's death is subject to a certain number of social, legal, and most relevant to us, halachic considerations. The choice of a given step in this process as the definitive moment of death, before each and every cell in the body has died, is determined not only by biological factors, but by a host of other factors as well. So just to extract the key point from that, a person is termed dead long before their body starts to decompose. But when? Which part of the process is the part when, if you will, the soul leaves the body? Which bit? Which bit is the halachic element of death? I can see that there's a question coming through the chat. All good. Any questions from here about any of that?
How do secular authorities take a moment of death? Like, does the definition in the Israeli medical system differ from the Australian medical system?
Excellent. The question for those at home is, how do secular authorities determine the moment of death? And this is where this question gets fascinating. In general, the moment of death for a long time was determined by cardiopulmonary cessation, irreversible. And generally speaking, that was fine because those two things kind of happened at the same time, more or less. It's only since the advent of ventilators that the possibility of that brain no longer working, but the heart still working, could exist. In some senses, by working through this stuff for organ transplantation and by developing the technologies, we've created a set of situations that didn't exist before, where we've split, or at least potentially split, what the brain's doing and what the heart's doing. Whereas previously that option didn't exist. So as a result of that, once we started thinking more about transplantation, that's when people started thinking, well, maybe brain death is death. Because the secular authorities, there was a lot of controversy around the very early heart transplants, because in some sense, maybe you're murdering. And that's not a great reason to save someone else. So it's only since heart transplants really got moving, we're talking the 60s, 70s, 80s, that there was movements away from the accepted definitions of what had been the definition of death forever, towards more contemporary definitions that exist where there's, brain death as one type of way of certifying death in contrast to irreversible cardiopulmonary. Okay? And we're going to see that in some of our rabbinic sources as well. So we'll get there. In the interest of time, we'll move through this quite quickly, but there are a few classical sources, and this is sort of the main one that it's necessary for us to understand this sugya, understand this topic. So we have actually seen a variation of this Mishnah previously for those who are paying lots of attention. But Mishnah alav mapolet. If you've got someone who is caught under fallen debris, and it's a question whether that person is there or whether that person is not there. It's a question if it's a Jewish person or a not Jewish person. In those situations, then you excavate. You excavate, which is a point that we saw last week. You excavate. If you find the person alive, then you continue excavating, even if this is what we saw last week, even if the thought is that they're not going to be alive for much longer. However, if you find them not alive, and this is a situation of on Shabbat, you do not keep breaking Shabbat for that person, because the overriding of the Shabbat obligations is only applicable in situations where it's a person who's alive. We don't override Shabbat for a person who's not alive. Now, the rabbis have a question. Tanu Rabbanan. Ad heichen hu bodek. How far are you meant to look? How are you meant to assess if a person's alive or not alive? Well, the first suggestion is ad chotmo, until the person's nostrils. In other words, you take a feather, you put it on top of the person's nostrils, and you see if it flatters or not. What metric are we using to assess if the person's alive? The lung function, the pulmonary, breathing, the yesh omrim. But there's another opinion, and for 10 points, what's the other opinion? Ad libo, his heart. So we've got both ideas being put forward in the Gemara of where to look for the definition of a person no longer being alive, the nostrils or the heart potentially. Now, this is just fascinating. There's another version of the Gemara, which exists in Rabbeinu Hananel and in the Rif and is coherent with the Yerushalmi. And that says the two different places that you look are the nose and the belly. What does that mean? Tiburo, the navel. How would that work? Yes. So this abdomen, the stomach is going to go up and down, up and down. If you're breathing, well, your abdomen is going to be moving as well. And the Gemara is going to continue and say that this actually represents, these aren't two separate opinions. This is one opinion, just talking about two different things. If you're going from the head down, then you should look to the nose. If you're going from the feet up, then you should look to the abdomen. Now that works really neatly because both of those things are about breathing. But we have to remember that that wasn't the version of the text that everyone had. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. There's no Google. These are, manuscripts that are being handwritten all through the world. So people have different manuscripts that say different things. So what I just presented is a really cogent reading of one version. But there's the other version, which is we go from the head down and you stop at the nose, or we go from the legs up and you stop not at the abdomen, but you stop at the heart. What are you meant to do with any of this? How are we meant to extract from this? So that's what the rabbis keep going and say. So from here, some rabbis will end up saying that this is valid reasoning to say that the respiration is the primary definition of life. Other rabbis will end up saying, no, you need both. And that ambiguity is actually parallel in one of the first sources that we see, which is happening from the later rabbis as they try to extract halacha from this stuff. So, which rabbi am I referring to? The Khatam Sofer. Rabbi Moshe Sofer, or Schreiber, he was one of the main traditionalist rabbis, and he had very, very traditional ideas about how things should be. one of his famous phrases was Chadash Asur Min Torah, novelty, new things are not permitted according to the Torah, which is a great pun as well. But that was one of his things. And in addition to having that perspective on the world, that was part of his political and religious orientation more generally. So he is known to have lots and lots of fights with the nascent reform movement. Specifically, this responsa that I've quoted is in reference to a position of Moses Mendelssohn, Rabbi Moses Mendelssohn. And Moses Mendelssohn is part of a group of people who are saying, in alignment with the Austro-Hungarian emperor at the time, this is very important but very complicated, but essentially that people should not be buried for a significant period of time because we want to make sure that we're not burying anyone who's actually alive. We want to make sure that we're only burying people who are definitely dead. And the way to make sure is to keep them unburied for 3 days. And if they're still dead by the end of 3 days, they're probably dead and you should bury them. Now, as someone mentioned earlier, is that something that we would think is aligned with our Jewish values? No, why not? Because there's a general prohibition against leaving someone who is not alive, leaving someone who is dead unburied for a significant period of time. And in that responsa, Rabbi the Chatam Sofer says, what's his definition of death that he employs? Ve'ein bo shum dveika, there's no heartbeat. Ve'im achar kach batel hanashima, and then afterwards, the breathing ceases. So he quotes both of these ideas of heart beating, stopping, and breathing, stopping, as part of his definition of death. So he brings both of them.
What about those rare cases where you do find somebody whose heart appears to stop and they appear to stop breathing, and 12 hours later they suddenly wake up?
Yeah, so I think that's why I've been quite careful to use the word irreversible. And I think it's important to keep that in mind in this conversation. There's lots of ways to work out irreversible, like things around being conscious of, has the person fallen into freezing cold water? Or have they died in a setting different to that? Or is there a drug that they have on board which could explain why they are the way that they are currently? So you have to do a lot more of that thinking about what else might be going on that could be causing them to be in the state that they are if they are not dead. Whereas, that's why we need to have really good criteria. There's a parallel conversation to all of this about how to assess these things, which we'll try to come to a little bit soon. But I think that's an important point to keep in mind, is that in addition to the thing itself, we have to talk about how we get to it. How do we assess to check if a person is, for example, if they are brain dead? How do we assess that? So we'll keep going. I just want to blitz through these because I'm quite conscious of the time. The Igros Moshe, of Moshe Feinstein, who we've met quite a few times, after the very, very first heart transplant, which we said occurred in 1967, Christian Barnard and operated and provided Louis Rishkansky with a heart in the late 60s, in 1967. By the year 1970, there had been 162 heart transplants that had been performed. How many of those people were still alive in 1970? 18. So there was 144 of them were no longer alive. 144 out of 162. And that's what led Rav Moshe Feinstein to say that if a person does a heart transplant, that would constitute double murder. And that's the phrase, Ritzichat shtei nefashot mamash. Double murder. Because what's he trying to say? That by extracting the heart, you are murdering the person who the heart is in. And by implanting the heart, you're taking a person who otherwise would have lived for a certain period of time, and realistically, their chances of survival are very low. Now, we all know that that's no longer the case. That was because in the early 80s, there was cyclosporine. Cyclosporine is one of the immunosuppressant drugs, and it was game-changing. It was completely revolutionary. And that's when we started to see, instead of all of these people who had these hearts and other organs transplanted dying shortly after, they survived. And in that setting, Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked again, well, what's going on now? You can't really say that there's this double murder going on, because maybe you can maintain that the extracting of the heart from the donor is problematic, but you can't maintain that the donating of the heart is necessarily murder, because objectively it's not. And one of the things that I am really moved by is the relationship that Rav Moshe had with his son-in-law, Rav Tendler. And Rav Tendler was a biochemist. He had a PhD. Also, he knew everything religiously and halachically as well. And Rav Moshe commissioned his son-in-law, Rav Tendler, to work out what's going on with all of this, to read all of the literature and to sort of present him with a bit of a dossier, if you will. And he did. And that led Rav Moshe to change his opinion. And that's what we see in the next source. This is the third little box. Even though a person has a heart and that heart is able to keep beating even for a few days. So we're talking about a potential recipient who is definitely in need of a heart, but has a heart that's at least working to some extent at this point. Sorry, I got that the wrong way around. It's talking about a person who is on a ventilator who would be termed brain dead. And what Rav Moshe is saying is that even though the heart is beating by itself, as long as the person does not have the ability to breathe independently, that person would therefore be considered like someone who's dead. So what we see is an acceptance by Rav Moshe Feinstein of the brain death criteria, which then opened the door in parallel with Rav Tendler's work, showing that accepting heart donations is acceptable because the rate of success is relatively high. It opened the door in religious settings for accepting brain death and accepting organ transplants at the same time. Yes.
I think scientific research will also never be seen as instant production of truth and best practice. One only learns how to make something better by actually trying it out and seeing.
Yes.
And if one can therefore argue that the procedure is likely, if we learn from it, to get better, that becomes then an argument for continuing that kind of practice and not being too absolute about, we only had 10% success rate.
So the comment is with reference to research, and I'm going to interpret it and say it's about the need to invest in research if we want things to improve. I think it's worth being honest with the group and saying that in halachic framing, there are certain barriers that you run up against, even in making that argument, in the sense that a person, I'll give you an example from a different context. In theory, a person is meant to see the best medical specialist. And in theory, the medical specialist that the person sees, only the top doctor should be doing certain things, and people should be seeing the top doctor, and the top doctor has an obligation to sort of put out their work into the world. But then you very quickly run up against a problem, which is how are you meant to train anyone if the person who's the best is the one doing everything? In some sense, it makes sense because, there's someone who knows how to do it really well. Why should we be getting people who don't know how to do it so well involved? But on the flip side, you need to train people. So, there are ways that people have found to work around that stuff, adequate supervision and the top doctor being involved still, et cetera, et cetera. And it's become about being above an acceptable threshold rather than being the absolute best at something. However, the halachic framing still exists. And same thing in this context, the halachic framing around a chole needing to be lefaneinu, there needing to be a specific person, like the fact that it would lead, like the autopsy example that I gave, donating a person's body to science in some sense would certainly help, but that doesn't bring it close enough to the definition of what you're allowed to do to then override the concerns that it would pose. So I'm not disagreeing with you in terms of the practicalities. I think this is something that we as a Jewish community, and particularly if I can say as a modern Orthodox community, need to grapple with. How do we, be citizens of the world who are responsible, who are contributing to all of these things, but at the same time, maintaining a fidelity to what we care about. You know, and I guess the best example in my mind is, you know, I find it quite difficult, the position where I'm willing to accept a heart, but I'm not willing to donate. You know, if you're willing to say that accepting the heart is, if you're not willing to accept brain death as death, then what you're willing, in other words, to say is that someone else has died or someone else is alive and has been killed by the removal of their heart, but I'm okay to accept that heart because it's going to save my life. It's saying that, and you know, I hear the logic for that position. You know, the heart's there anyways, I might as well take it. But I have an issue with it as an ethical position. And I think that, you know, all of us can make our own thoughts and decisions about that, but I'm sharing my personal discomfort with that position. Does that sort of respond? Yeah, no trouble. Should we keep going or any other questions? Let's keep going. So to dovetail with what we just mentioned about research and about scientific progress taking time, we can meet the position of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So we've met the position of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who essentially is saying that this is one read of Rav Moshe's opinion. Notice that there are other readings as well, and his position is disputed, but that's a complicated conversation. But essentially, let's take, you know, because Rav Moshe said that, his son Rav David has said that, and many other people's understanding of Rav Moshe reflects that as well. And Rav Tendler has said that all publicly. But there are people who dispute Rav Moshe's position and say that Rav Moshe never really reneged on his earlier position. I think that's just worth sharing for completeness with the group. But I think that there are certainly very valuable people like Rav Tendler, like Rav David Feinstein, and many other people who had personal correspondence with Rav Moshe who say that this is Rav Moshe's position. Okay, let's keep going. Next position is that of Rav Shlomo Zalman. What does Rav Shlomo Zalman say? So to contrast, there are some people, you know, and we've got them at the bottom, Rav Vosner, Rav Eliezer Woldenberg, they're saying essentially, I understand that we have to interpret death as cardio, as heart and lung stopping, and that's it. There are certainly some, and I don't want to minimize their position. There are, you know, great rabbis who are saying this. There are certainly great rabbis who say that. And those would be in that far left column on the bottom. Rav Vosner is an example, Rav Eliezer Woldenberg is an example. There are other people as well. But on the other side that we've met is Rav Moshe's opinion. And in Rav Moshe's opinion, we can also add the Chief Rabbinate of Israel and the Rabbinical Council of America. They have all sort of issued positions that they're aligned with brain death being an acceptable definition of death. They all have slightly different definitions around what the tests to define brain death are, but let's leave that aside because that's going to get us a lot longer than the time that I wanted to finish. Rav Shlomo Zalman's opinion is really interesting. He is essentially willing to accept brain death as a definition of death, but he thinks that testing is not really conclusive. He thinks that we don't have great tests to work it out. And particularly, he's caught in a bit of a catch-22 because we know that a body at the very end of its life, a gosses, which is a concept that we met last week, a person should not be touching that body. A person should not be moving that body. So if you're going to take that body and wheel it down to a CT scanner and do the same scan that you would to see if someone's had a stroke, with contrast, what you're going to be doing is injecting contrast into their veins and wheeling them all the way downstairs. So you've got a problem where, on the one hand, the tests that you can do at the bedside are not conclusive enough. But on the other hand, if you're going to wheel them all the way to the CT scanner and do that test, and let's say, for example, for argument's sake, that test is conclusive enough, then you've potentially gone and you've ignored other prohibitions. So that's Rav Shlomo's opinion, Rav Shlomo Zalman's opinion. It is worth noting that since he published that opinion, there have been 2 tests which people have developed, which lead people to say that Rav Shlomo's opinion sort of become moot, because we do have bedside tests which could potentially be good enough. And those would be what's called the transcranial Doppler, which is basically an ultrasound that you're going to put at the back of the person's head at their brainstem, and you'll check if there's blood flow to the brainstem using this ultrasound probe, or brainstem auditory evoked response. You'll put some electrodes on the back of a person's head, and you'll make various noises, and you'll see if they're hearing, if they've picked up these noises or not. Those tests are potentially conclusive enough and do not require any sort of moving or touching of the body or anything like that. Moving is the big problem. Touching is less of a problem. It's moving that's the main problem. Okay, so there's Rav Shlomo's opinion is what it is, and there's potential that it's become moot in the context of these developments around better tests. Breathe. Are we okay? Have I lost everyone? No. Okay, any questions or anything? No? Okay.
Just to remind us, these are issues involved in the work of the book.
Yes.
That's why I'm thinking it's not just back in the summer and like metaphysical issues, that whether it's legitimately removable without considering that you possibly murder.
Yes, so Philip has helpfully brought us back to the core topic that we're talking about. Just for framing, the reason why we spent so much time on that is because that is one of the core debates that exist in this topic. And I think that sort of a familiarity with it is necessary. You know, I think people often hear about certain issues, which I think are, this is a very legitimate issue in the conversation around organ donation. There are other issues that are put forward, which in my opinion are sort of less, there's less concern around them. You know, some people you might hear would say about like, oh, I can't have part of a pig in my heart as a heart valve, for example, which, you know, we all know that eating the pig is the problem. Getting a heart valve from a pig is not the problem. Another example of something which is less of an issue is people might say that in the resurrection of the dead, in Techiyat HaMeitim, you want bodies to be complete. And, you know, there are a very small minority of people who do say that, but the overwhelming majority of poskim are not concerned by that prospect. And I don't think, you know, on the scale of issues, that that's the one that we should be spending our time with, because it's a real minority of positions that note an issue in terms of the resurrection of the dead. But the organ of the brain element is a huge one that I think we do need to give the airtime. So that's what I was trying to focus on.
That's an important point in regard to the rituals and aspects of the burial, that a body is still considered in a dignified state, even though it might have had organs removed from it.
Yes.
And so it can still be subjected to the tahara and the,
yes.
and the dressing and all the other things that are done to a body before it's buried.
Yes. So Philip's point is that that in view of everything that we've said, it's important to mention that none of this is going to preclude people from having a Jewish burial and all of the associated rituals. Before we move on to the final set of sources, were there any questions or things that we wanted to discuss further?
I want to get one thing here.
Sure.
If we're talking about complete cessation of what is,
yeah, it's hard.
How in that state is a heart still viably able to be transplanted?
Sure. So in a situation where there's complete cessation of brainstem function, what you've got is the body is connected to a ventilator. And that's part of why that number that we saw at the beginning, you know, 170,000 dropped so quickly. Because, you know, we need people who are in hospital and we need people who are in either in ICU or in an emergency department with access to this stuff. And then what needs to happen is one way to explain what's going on, and it's a little bit crude, but I think it makes the point, is that there's the ventilation of a corpse that's occurring, in the sense that there's air being shoved in through the ventilator into the person's lungs. That's causing the lungs to keep breathing. You know, there's the air going in and then there's the air out, in, out. And it's the air itself which is causing the lungs to work, being pushed in by the ventilator rather than the stretching of the lungs themselves. Then the heart keeps pumping by itself because the heart has an intrinsic pacemaker. It works, it keeps on working by itself. You can take a heart out of a person's body and it will keep pumping. It won't do so for so long because eventually it will run out of oxygenated blood if it's outside of a person's body. But in this setting, you're still getting the oxygenated blood. So you can't do it indefinitely, sure, but you can do it for a short period. And it's in that short period that the transplant surgery will occur. That's why people get calls at 3 o'clock in the morning. Sure. Are we okay with that? Yes. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll go to the last set of sources.
So I saw on TV the other night, it's not just the timing of that, the incredible need to quickly move the body part to where it has to go.
Yes.
There was quite an interesting scene with police cars at high speed, sirens flashing, off to the airport, putting it onto a plane in an icebox
Yeah.
and flying it to somewhere to get to the donor, at the recipient place in a great hurry.
So Paul's mentioning, you know, the incredible timeliness that this all requires, and it really becomes a race against the clock, and that's certainly the case. And again, it's worth mentioning that there are different organs with different senses of urgency, like Rabbi Steinberg was mentioning. So, you know, there are different organs at different rates that would have issues. I just think that's an important point to mention.
Hearts aren't that urgent, because what they do is they stop the heart using salts of hypertension. It's called cardioplegia, and the heart then stops. And the magic thing is, when you take those salts away, it starts beating again.
Yeah,
It's
fascinating.
really amazing. So you actually have more time with the heart than with certain other organs.
Fascinating. So I want to wrap us up focusing on the last couple of sources. And I think, you know, the framing that I brought at the beginning, I think is really important. I'm not here to tell you what your halachic positions should be. I think that's a decision that everyone should make by themselves in conversation with their rabbis. And I think that, you know, there are various legitimate opinions in this conversation, as we've mentioned. I do think that it's worth emphasizing, you know, rather than focus on what we can't do, when our Judaism says this is a problem or that's a problem, or, you know, my understanding interpretation says this and that's a problem, let's focus on what we can do. You know, and that's the source that I've brought from Yechaver Da'at, which is Rav Ovadia Yosef, who we met in a previous session as well. And he's saying that, you know, shemutar v'gam mitzvah litrom kliya achat, that it's permissible, and moreover, it's actually a mitzvah to donate a kidney, because that will help a person and that will improve their quality of life. And whatever the specific definition is for you, whether that's donating blood regularly or whether that's potentially donating, you know, a bone marrow or a kidney or any other thing, hopefully in the setting of being live donors, but potentially in the setting of deceased donors as well. You know, whatever the religious positions that you come to, let's focus on what we can do rather than what is potentially an issue. And on that note, I'd like to encourage everybody, you know, this is an incredible good that there's the potential to do. So I've brought a few options of how people can become organ donors, but I want to finish on the source from Igros Moshe, which is a powerful source. Rav Moshe, I think that, you know, echoing that idea of what we can do, I think the primary barrier that exists is not a barrier around religious halachic position. I think it's issues of access and community will and awareness and all of these other things that we see in every other issue around the world. You know, I have a master's in public health, and that's one of the points that they kept emphasizing in that context, is that, you know, people like to focus on the sort of big ideological differences that exist, but much more issues are often related to access and often related to things that are much like sort of, they're less interesting maybe to talk about, but they're much more real. You know, so one, not to say that this is less interesting, but, you know, one point that Rav Moshe Feinstein makes is that there's a huge emotional burden that's encountered. And I found that quite moving to see, you know, this big rabbi talk about the emotional burden that's encountered with donating organs. So, by law, there's no obligation. Aval mitzvah vadai ika. There is certainly a mitzvah to donate. Even though a person's sort of natural response might to feel pained, greatly pained, al metor, by the death of their loved one, yoter me'al kol mamon, or more than they would be pained by the loss of all of their finances. Mistaber shechiyuv leka. There's no obligation. V'lachein mitzvah shelo yitzta'er tova. They should donate, and they shouldn't be excessively pained. V'yatzil nefesh ve'ever shel metor, and they should try to save by donating something. And it's this idea of a recognition that, you know, maybe in donating, there's a way for some of that healing. And I think that's what Rav Moshe is trying to speak to as well, that maybe there's potential for some healing and not to be excessively pained by the difficult decisions that are often faced in terms of organ donation at end of life. And to that end, I've noted the Australian Organ Donor Registry that people can sign up to if they so choose. And in that registry, there's an option for including which specific organs. And in the Halachic Organ Donor Society, there's options for including which definitions of brain death, for example, people would like to subscribe to. And notice that in Australia, like I said at the beginning, that organ donation is always in conversation with a person's next of kin. And it's not something that's going to be done without the next of kin involvement. And to that end, that's a potential point where a person's, if they so choose, their rabbis or their can be involved in that conversation as well to make sure that it is the way that people would like it to be. So, I would encourage people to give this concept, this topic some thought, have those conversations with their loved ones and make the decisions that are right for them, noting that there's the potential to do an enormous amount of good in this context as well.
Can the family override permission?
No, family cannot. Sure. So the question for those at home is, how does one do HODS for Australia? So Bati and I actually had a lot of fun going through the HODS website and looking at all of the rabbis who'd signed up to the HODS website. And there are some Australian rabbis on that list. So definitely people have managed to do it. There's just sort of the registration link, I assume. As in, I think that it's, again, it comes back to that conversation with the family. Yeah, and that's why I think it's important. Rav Noam's mentioned that it can be an immediate conversation that needs to happen. And that's why I think it's important to at least have a preliminary conversation with people's families in advance. But yes, definitely note that, it can be a quick conversation and there's the potential to involve religious counsel throughout the process as well. So Soli's mentioning that the Sydney Bet Din has done a lot of work on it as well for those at home. Yep. So I think, so my understanding is that I'm not sure the specifics is the truth. I sort of briefly looked at both of them. I don't know the specifics, that's the honest answer. I do know that in Australia, there's always the option for the family to be involved, and it needs to be a conversation that the family is agreeable to. So I think that's a point where we can bring in, a person is able to bring in their own religious counsel in that regard. No, you certainly have time. No, but that's, so I think that there's, as in, if the answer is no, then the answer is no. But, and if you don't have the time to do it as well as in a way that you'd like, then that's a separate conversation. But, like I emphasize, I think it's important to focus on what we can do rather than the barriers. But certainly situations happen and it can be really, really complicated. But at the same time, there's the potential for things to be going well as well. There is the potential for rabbis to be involved if that's something that's really important to people. Yeah.
Well, the other issue that you haven't really discussed is aging. Because
Yes.
the older you are, the less valuable your organs actually become in terms of the transplant, because they're not working all that well anymore.
Yeah, so definitely there's a lot of issues that we didn't raise through this, and this was just designed broad brushstrokes, but certainly how this fits, and it's not just age, there's many criteria that make, and it's organ specific, that make different organs more or less suitable for transplantation. Yeah.
Topic of incentive donate. For those who donate a kidney and then later in life need a kidney, do they have priority over those who haven't?
Yeah.
And if not,
Interesting question. So the question for those at home is incentivizing kidney donation, for example, and whether there's a prioritization of people who've previously donated a kidney. The answer, I think, is that every jurisdiction is different in that regard. What's fascinating about Israel is that Israel was the first place to incentivize, to prioritize people who were on the organ donor list, to then, if they ever needed a donation themselves, that they would be bumped up the list. So I think that, that's as well as there being halachic elements to the prioritization allocation conversation, there are sort of structuring of society elements and legal elements. And, you know, that's one example of how Israel navigates it. But yeah, it's a fascinating conversation. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Going back to my question that I asked previously, which I obviously didn't express clearly enough. If you accept the alternative definition of death as not brain death,
Mm-hmm.
are any of your organs actually viable?
Yes. Yes, they are. They are viable. Depends which organs and depends how long, it depends the setting of death, etc., etc. But yes, there are organs that can be transplanted. And if you look on the like halachic organ donation, nearly all of the rabbis on that have accepted the brain death definition of death. But some of them have certainly, you know, some of them have not. And, you know, for those rabbis, yes, you know, a kidney is a good example that could potentially, because it has to do with how long the organ can be without blood before it starts to become a problem. And every organ in the body is slightly different in that regard. So, you know, the brain we know is one that's like really essential that it has blood, and the heart's also one that's very essential that it has blood. But there are other organs that are can survive for much longer without blood. Yeah. Yep. Last question, and I think we'll wrap up.
It's about the Australian Organ Donor Registry.
Yep.
Is that the same one that shows up in your MyGov Medicare?
I believe so. So the question is the one that I've referenced the same one that shows up in the MyGov? I believe it is. I believe they're all interlinked and interconnected.
So in that respect, when people are looking to see whether someone's an organ donor or not, if the medical professional has access to that person's Medicare record, most medical practitioners do, they find it there.
Yes, but I think there's still a subsequent conversation with them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, a couple of things just about upcoming. So this week on Wednesday, there is a session with Rabbi Zach Gomo, which is going to be fascinating. It's with reference to the 3 weeks. And it's going to be, Zach's always got a lot of really interesting things to say. I assume he'll be talking about some of the history of as well as he always does. So I think that's a fascinating thing that everyone should come to if possible. Also on Shabbos, we're going to be lucky enough to have Rabbi Marcus Solomon be here and give the drasha. And that will also be the baby naming for Ellie and Jackie, which should be lovely for their daughter that was born. Also, we've got our final session, which is going to be next week, together on Monday nights. And for that session, it was TBD for a while. And the reason that it was TBD was because I wanted to make sure that I thought I could do that session well. Obviously, all of our sessions are quite sensitive and have potential that really need that sensitivity. The final session is going to be on termination of pregnancy. And for that session, I've involved Dr. Danielle Whitner, who's a religious OBGYN. And I think she's a person who's really well placed to have that conversation with me. You know, we're going to certainly have the sensitivity that I hope we've brought to all of our sessions, but certainly be quite aware that it's necessary in that context as well. And yeah, I think that, you know, Dr. Whitner is going to be awesome. And I highly recommend if everyone is available and should come, it should be lovely. On that end, happy to stick around if anyone has questions, but yeah, thank you all very much for coming.